There we go. So an appraiser can do different things than a non-provisional broker and a full broker can do. We're going to see some definitions, like the definition of value, and we're going to see forces and factors affecting value, both the economic principles of value and some other things as well. So there are three ways that an appraiser can determine the value of a property. And it depends on the type of property. So, nope, sorry. If it's a single family property or a condo or residential, which would be 1 to 4 units, okay, good. That's what I wanted. So the three ways would be the sales comparison method, the cost approach, and the income approach. This sales comparison method is right here over my head. I had to change some things here. And then the cost approach, and then the income approach. So it has to do with the type of property. If what the appraiser is appraising is a place you're going to, is a residential property, which means 1 to 4 units, like a single family or a condo or a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex or a townhouse, then they'll use the comparison method, which is the same thing you do when you're deciding when you're trying to shop for a car, right? What do you do when you're shopping for a car? You look at other cars, right? You want to see how much did the other Ford Pintos, yeah, that's a car from 85 years ago. How much did they sell for? And what did they have in them? And so you do your shopping, you compare. And that's what we're basically doing. The bulk of what we do in residential real estate is using the sales comparison method. So we use it for 1 to 4 unit properties and land. If we're valuing either of these things, we're going to use the sales comparison method. So the other ones are the cost approach. This one is for unique properties. Things like a school building. If you're in the commercial, maybe the commercial sector of the business, maybe a school, an old school, church, government building. There's no neighborhoods full of old churches. And so you can't just see that 3 churches sold last week for $800,000. So we need to do it a different way. We can't do the sales comparison method anymore. We've got to do it, or the appraiser would have to do it by estimating how much it would cost to build new. So the short version, we'll get into this cost approach more detailed later, but the short version of it is the cost to build it new today, subtract out a percentage for depreciation since the building is not new, and then add back in the cost, the value of the land. So you want to depreciate the building after determining how much would it cost to build that building new today, and then add it in with the cost of the land or the value of the land, and that is the cost approach. It has its errors. It has its flaws. It's not great because it will tend to be the highest amount. The highest value will probably be derived by using the cost approach. So it's not necessarily the most accurate thing, but it's the most appropriate method to use when it's that type of property, school, church, government building kind of thing. And then finally, if you're an investor, and this is an investment rental property of some sort, it could be a single family home. It could be a 100-unit apartment complex or more or less. But the income approach gives more credit to the math, to the financials of how much the total gross income is, and then subtract out for expenses. And we'll see things like net operating income, for instance. Those are all things that we'll talk about when we get to this income approach. And so the appraiser first has to decide, what type of property am I here to appraise? And therefore, which of the 3 methods should I give more credit to? It could very well be that the appraiser uses all three methods just to see what each one comes in at. But then they need to give more weight to the number they got using the method that matches the property. In other words, let's say it's a rental home that is it's a rental house, and therefore they figure out that it's worth $350,000 when they compare it to other similar properties. They use the comparison method and figured out $350,000 is what we think this would sell for compared to what similar houses like it have sold for. And then let's say they use the cost approach and say, well, if we had to build it new and then depreciate it to the point that this house's condition is in, then I think it'd probably be worth $380 using the cost approach. Or since it's a rental, let me look at the rent and the other issues and how much it costs to operate it. And then I find that it's worth $375,000 using the income approach. So the next question is, at the end of the appraisal, after he's done all of these three methods, is which one do we use? Which number? What you don't do, as we'll see in a little while, is you do not ever average these three numbers. Never take the average of the three approaches. What the appraiser would do is say, what is it? How is this property being used? Is it being used as an owner occupied home? No. We said it's a rental. Oh, it's over here. It's an income property. Therefore, more weight needs to be given. We need to assume that it's going to be worth closer to the 375 than the 380. By the way, again, the cost approach probably is going to be the highest number of estimate that comes in. So we're not using that one because that's not the best description of the type of property this is. So we'll get into all of that. And that's basically what those three approaches to value look like. So let's look at some terms. Market value. What do you think market value is? Oh, yeah, sure thing. Let me address that a little bit later, Jack. But tell me this in the chat. Market value is what? What do you think the market value is?
The neighborhood similar house.
Would sell for.
Do we think it's what things have sold for or what we think this property will sell for?
The property will sell for.
The price a buyer will pay and a seller will accept. Yeah. It's what we think might happen. Our educated guess, whether the we as us as brokers or an appraiser. What about market price? What's the difference between market value and market price?
The price that neighborhood sold.
The actual price it sold for. Exactly right. And then finally, the cost. What do we think the cost might be? Costs would be what? This one makes it fun on a listing appointment. Costs are past expenditures on the property. And a lot of times when we're on that listing appointment, the seller will be very proud of all the work they've done on a property and overestimate how much that has added to the value of the property. They might say something like this: look, that deck I've put on the back of the property, I built that by hand. Me and my son cultivated the lumber from the woods in the back, and sorry. And so it's sentimental, right? We put a lot of work into it, my son and I, and we've carved our family's names into it. And therefore we think it probably adds about $100,000 to the value of the property. The cost that they spent on it, whether in sweat equity or actual money, is not necessarily reflected in the value. So we got to have that discussion with them, right? We've got to make sure they understand, look, I think it's a great addition that you put on this property. I think it looks wonderful. You did a great job, but we are limited by what buyers have been willing to pay for properties like this. So let me share with you what buyers have been willing to pay. So cost is a challenging term to deal with. So there's 3 ways to report valuation. The appraiser uses the appraisal. The brokers use one of these other 2. Brokers either use the comparative market analysis or the broker price opinion. That's what we as brokers could do. And we'll learn in a little bit what the difference is between those 2 things. But the appraisal is reserved only for the appraiser. We can never appraisal for the appraiser. We can never call what we do an appraisal. A CMA and a BPO, market analysis and a price opinion, are basically the same thing. We can't call those an appraisal at all. Appraisers are delivering a market value or a worth, the property's worth, and they're giving an exact number when they get to the last page of that appraisal report and they say, here's what we think it's worth. We as brokers should do a probable sale price. The thing that we say is, look, this is what I think this house will probably sell for. The probable sale price, probable list price. And we should give it in a range because it's just smarter to give it in a range. What if we do our homework and we decide that this house should sell anywhere from $450 to $475 based on the comparables that I've looked at. I've seen similar houses as yours, and this is again from the perspective of us as brokers. And I've seen some sell for $450, some for $475. And then, Mr. Seller, where it falls in this range depends on you, right? If you do everything I ask you to do, stage it like you're promising you're going to, declutter, clean, stage it, get rid of some things, put some pretty things in its place, then we could probably expect to get toward the upper end of that range. But sometimes in real life, guys, the seller promises to do these things and then they get busy and they say, oh, I couldn't get around to all that. I was going to paint over the fuchsia and the aqua in the living room, but I didn't have time. Let's just put it on the market. Okay. But we'll probably have to pay for that privilege, right? Of not having to do the work. You might get more like the lower end of the range. So it's just smarter and a more advantageous for us as brokers not to paint ourselves in a corner. We don't want to promise 475 and then they let us down and then they still think it's 475, right? So the range is the best practice. Here's that comparable sales method. The subject property, which you can't see because of my head. Let me get out of the way. Subject property is the property in question. That's the thing that that is being valued or we're trying to figure out the value of. And sorry, guys. There we go. So that's the property we're going to list, the property we're going to sell. We need to compare it to things that have actually sold. So we're going to look up, do our research, probably in the multiple listing service, and find similar houses that have sold nearby. Those are called comparables or comps or sales comps. They're the properties used to figure out what that subject property should sell for. So we're going to use these to figure out what this should probably sell for because the best indicator of value is past performance. What these got on the market will probably dictate what this one will get. So that's just economics, right? But the process is involved. We have to make sure we make proper adjustments. This comparable property might have sold for $350,000. Oops, not that one. 350 over here, and then maybe this one sold for 360, and then maybe this one sold for 373. So the question is, How do these relate to the subject? And so that's what the appraiser is going to do on his appraisal. It's what we're going to do on our market analysis. We're going to say, oh, well, this one had a 4-car garage, whereas the subject property had a 3-car garage. And so we need to figure out what the difference in dollars of a 1-car garage is based on our knowledge of the market, of the neighborhood. And an appraiser, all they do all day long is appraisals. So do we think subjectively they are maybe better at this whole valuation thing than we are? If we're out there showing property, going on listing appointments, going to closings, doing lots of different things, they're doing that one thing. They're probably getting better at it, and they're probably a more reliable source. But they charge more to do their appraisal than we could to do our CMA or BPO. So they might have determined, we also, because we're familiar with the neighborhood and we do our research, have determined that a 1-car garage has a value of $12,000. And if that's the case, we would say if everything else is the same between these two properties, except for the garage difference, and if this subject had more garages than the comparable had more garages than the subject, then we need to subtract $12,000 from what that comparable sold for. And so instead of $350 with a 4-car garage, let's see what it would have sold for with a 3-car. It would have sold for $338, right? $350 minus 12, theoretically. And then we make other adjustments. And those other adjustments might be brick siding versus vinyl siding, or 2,300 square feet instead of 22,000 square feet, or an upgraded kitchen for this 20-year-old house compared to the original kitchen from 20 years ago. That's going to take an adjustment too. So we need to make adjustments to all of these comps. And then we'll take those adjusted comps. We care more about the adjusted sale prices than these actual sale prices, because what we're trying to do is figure out what that means for this subject property here, right? So it's a process, and there's a special certain criteria of these comps matter, right? We got to pick comps that are smart. We can't just use any old house that's sold. We need to make sure it's as similar as possible. So what the appraiser does looks a little different. Their appraisal report looks very official, very professional. It's a big spreadsheet. It literally has the word opinion at the top. It is literally the appraiser's opinion. So even though it looks scientific, which it kind of is, it's still their opinion. Because if we hired 3 appraisers to do the same work on the same house, they would have different opinions of the different adjustments needed to be made for the garage, for the siding, for the square feet. And so that's sort of where the human element comes in. By the way, the appraisal is the best way to figure out what something's truly worth, because I don't know if you've heard of it. I say it that way because I know you have. Other valuation methods, online valuators, Zestimates, Realtor.com has them. Did they send a human out to notice that the kitchen was updated on this house compared to that house? No. They are going by the ever important algorithm, which often includes the most flawed of all data, tax information. And so if they're looking at tax values and tax square footage, guess what's most commonly wrong on the tax record? The square feet. Because the owner never wants to correct it, because it's usually wrong to the downside. And so we can't really rely on the online estimators so much. In fact, the CEO of one of those major companies online, their estimate was like, 30-40% off from the actual value that it sold for. So this is the best way. We've got an appraiser giving an estimate or opinion of value called a market value. It's more of an art form than a science. A licensed appraiser is required to do the appraisal. They are governed by the Uniform Standards for appraisals. And then also there's an appraisal board that they have to answer to, like we have to answer to the commission. So if they misbehave, by the way, they are misbehaving, some of them, because there is a sort of a phenomenon, I won't say epidemic, but it definitely happens in the market, even this day and age, called appraisal bias or racial bias. Appraisers saying, hey, this property is near this protected class of people, therefore, because it's in this neighborhood, it's worth less. That's illegal. It's racial bias in appraisals, and it's in this current update that we're teaching. And the real estate commission says, turn them in, report them to the appraisal board, and then tell your client to tell the lender that this appraisal is no good because we're suspecting it to have bias in its estimation of value. Therefore, we need a new one that's not biased. And then they also go on to say, hey, agents we get real protective of our clients. So don't be the hero. Don't reach out to that appraiser directly and tell them why they're a big jerk. Just go through the process, turn them in, and let the chips fall, let the system work. So that's a part of it too. They do have someone to answer to. Here's another weird thing about appraisals. Before they do the appraisal, the appraisers find out what the sale price is. They're not just doing it blind. We are. When we're deciding and trying to figure out the value of a house, well, again, there I used the wrong word, the probable sale price of a house, we're going in kind of blind. We're going in and having to look at those comps and, 1, 2, at least 3 comps and figure out, and it might have been that the comps are a little bit old because not a lot of activity has happened. So, but the appraiser is coming in once it has gone under contract. That means a buyer has stepped forward and said, hey, I'll pay this. And the appraiser gets to see that number. That doesn't mean that that's what it's going to appraise for, but quite often it is. If that appraiser is going to be looking for reasons not to appraise it for that number, they still need comps 1, 2, and 3, and maybe even more. And they still need to make adjustments for each of them and then figure out what does this mean for the subject property. But I've always thought it was kind of weird that they do get to see the price, the contract price. So what else? There is an expiration date. What do you think the expiration date of this appraisal report is? Your best guess, expiration date of the appraisal report.
One day.
Pretty good. Pretty much right on the money. Some people think maybe 30 days. Some people think maybe up until the closing. But essentially, as long as it takes for it to cool off from the printer, it's almost immediately out of date, essentially. Does that mean we have to get a new appraisal closer to closing? No. But what it really means, what they're really trying to point out here is that the appraisal is going to use comps. So let's say it's this comp, these 3 comps, it's going to use these. And then that gets published today. And so it came out at 350 using these comps. But then tomorrow, another comp sells, which they can't use because this has already been turned in. And maybe that other comparable sale would have been even a closer match than any of these 3 and would have affected this price. But it's irrelevant. They can't go back and add it in. And so it's really only as good as the date on which it is printed. So, yeah, good point. There is sort of an expiration date, and they do have to follow these minimum standards. When we come back from break, we'll talk about CMAs and BPOs. I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. welcome back. Let's come on back together, get those cameras on, and talk about the difference between a CMA and a BPO. These are the two things that we as brokers could do. Brokers do one of these two things. We don't do the appraisal. But it's similar math, similar process, right? We're picking comparables. We're applying those comparables to a subject property. And then that just leaves us with the question, what's the difference between these two things? The CMA and the BPO really depends on who you're doing them for. So the CMA is typically a free thing that we do. It's free because it's part of the variety of things we're doing to list a property. Usually free because we're doing a CMA and as a part of our listing duties, our listing to-do list. And we're doing it for clients, but also potential clients. We could be doing a CMA for a buyer or a seller, or a buyer that we're trying to talk into hiring us, or a seller that we're trying to talk into hiring us. A CMA for a buyer is going to be what we do to help them decide what to make the offer for. How much should we offer on the property? Let me do the comps. Let me do a CMA and to give you an idea of how much of what we might want to go in with as an offer. It's part of our fiduciary duties, right? That fiduciary word that we've seen a lot. It's part of it's a requirement to do a CMA for our clients or even our potential clients. And then the BPO is something we do for money in and of itself as a standalone. That BPO is something that we would do because somebody paid us to tell them what the probable sale price is. And it's non-fiduciary. It's not part of that listing procedure or process. It's for customers, not clients. So what sorts of entities or people would we do as a BPO for? If it's not a listing client or a potential listing client, who might actually want to pay us for our expertise on what the probable sale price on this property is? Who might want to pay us? Any ideas?
Someone looking to invest in like investment or commercial properties.
That's a good idea. Maybe somebody that doesn't want to hire us for our full scope of tasks. They just want an idea of what the property is worth without paying for it, without paying for an appraisal, because an appraisal is probably going to be like $400 to $600. Unless it's a specialty appraisal, it could be more than $1,000 or $2,000, but definitely $400 or $500 compared to a BPO that a broker does. Typically, you might get $75 to $100 for doing a BPO for somebody. That BPO is not a way to get rich quick. The reason you're doing it, well, for one thing, one of the people that you might be doing it for is a bank. Maybe that bank wants to decide if they need to foreclose on the property or not. And so they say, well, let me not pay $500 for an appraisal, but instead let me just pay for the BPO. And that'll be like $100 instead of $500. So it could be a bank. It could also be a for sale by owner, seller. They say clearly, I don't want to list it. Don't even ask me to list it with you. But I do value your opinion. I see your material all the time, and I appreciate you came here to see if you could help me. You can help me. Let me pay you $100. Tell me what the probable sale price is. So they're just paying you for the BPO in this case. So a CMA, it could also be called a CMA, but for the most part, the BPO means they're paying you. It's not tied to you listing the property. They just want to know your opinion about this thing without having to get an official appraisal, which costs more. That CMA is part of the listing duties. Let's see. Provisional brokers, though, not allowed to do BPOs. You can't be a provisional and make money doing BPOs, you got to get rid of that provisional status. What Zillow does would not be considered a BPO or a CMA. It's just an estimate, an online estimator, because there's no human making adjustments. There's purely algorithm based, and they can't possibly see the differences between the houses, right? They didn't come inside and see that the kitchen on house A had a $20,000 improvement, but the kitchen on house B has the original one. They don't know that. To them, these are the same, because all they have to go by is what's in the online records, the sales data. And so it's not great. And they're frequently off by a significant amount. So what else? Yeah, only non-provisionals can do CMAs or BPOs for money. Broker can't do a BPO in some certain situations. So we could say it this way: say no to the BPO unless it's for one of these uses below. If it's to make a loan, as much as a bank might like to pay you $100 instead of the appraiser $400 or $500, they've got to get an appraisal done if it's for originating a mortgage. They also have to use the appraisal if they're refinancing. And then sometimes the appraisal is just a law requirement for maybe some sort of maybe a judge says, in this divorce, we need to get an appraisal, not just a broker's opinion. So I demand the appraisal. Now that has to be what's done. Whatever reason the law requires the appraisal, that's enough. And therefore that appraisal would need to be what's done instead of the BPO. And then that brings us to some elements of value. When you talk about elements of value that we're looking for, what affects value? Well, one thing that affects it is desirability, and desire plus financial ability affects the value. Well, number one, how bad do people want it? And right now people want properties pretty bad because there's not a lot of them to pick from, but they also might want one because they're moving here. And so they are being transferred. And so they have to have a place for their family to live, versus I kind of just maybe might want to move someday. And so the value is going to be worth more over here than over here, right? For that person that's got more of a desire to buy this property. And then, yeah, their financial ability affects the value and desirability too, because can they actually perform? Do they have the ability to qualify for that loan in order to buy this thing? Utility, how the buyer is going to use the property, that affects the value. Maybe this is a house in a special neighborhood that has HOA rules that allow the business use that they want. And not every neighborhood does. And so if they need to work from home for a dog kennel and have dogs in the backyard making a bunch of noise, not every HOA, probably no HOA would allow it. They're going to have to buy something not in that environment. So the usage affects the value too. And then the scarcity, which is what we're dealing with now. The limited supply affects the value. It shoots up. Value goes up because there's not a lot to pick from, and the buyers have to fight over the few that are around. It goes back to that old saying, the three most important words in real estate are location, location, location. So that brings us to how easy will it be to do this closing, to transfer this property, this title. That affects the value too, because if there's a lot of clouds on the title, it's going to make it harder to transfer. And therefore the value would go down. If there are a lot of liens on the property and the seller can't clear them up and the buyer is going to buy it subject to the liens, then you better believe they're not going to pay $400 for it. They're going to need to think, how much are all those liens going to cost me? So maybe I'll pay you $310 because I got to allow enough space financially to pay off these liens that I'm buying it that are already in and they're staying in place. So what else? All of these qualities are part of any property. They all factor into the value of the property. There are four forces affecting property values: social ones, economic ones, political and physical ones. And so social might have to do with what you like to do. So because you want to live at the lake doing lake things, then you're going to have to pay the price for a house at the lake that lets you do lake things. Or a fancy recreation area, swimming, tennis, pickleball, right? That's a new one now too. So if you want to be in an area where you can walk to the pickleball court, walk to the pool, walk to the weight room, the clubhouse, you pay the price for that. And this also relates to those 55 and older communities, because a big draw for those is the amenities. It's not just that only 55 can live there, which is the case, but they want to live there because of all those extras that they're getting. That's one of the big reasons that that they get real popular. And oftentimes the cost per month on these things is like in excess to $250 per month on top of all the other dues for these social features. Economic forces that affect value: property taxes. And in my market, I'm here in Cabarrus County, but Mecklenburg is where Charlotte is. And then I'm over here in Cabarrus, and a lot of people live or need to work in Charlotte, but they go out to Cabarrus because the taxes are lower, although we're catching up. That's sort of not so much a feature anymore because economics. And that's sort of the way Charlotte is, just as an overall benefit. A lot of the surrounding counties are benefiting because people need to work in Charlotte, but they don't want to live there, either because of the school assignments or the taxes, or both. And then another one are political forces affecting values, like zoning. There's a zoning board, and they vote to change the zoning rules and laws. And so that affects things politically. Who's on that board? Where's the zoning? Like me, I have industrial I-1 zoning, and the city of Concord won't let me change it. If I were to try to get it changed to residential, they won't, because they want to keep that zoning in place because they don't want to give up any of their commercial or industrial zoning. And then we have physical like proximity. Is it close to highways, close to public transportation? Those affect the value too, just because of ease of use. Let's see. Let's look at some economic principles of value. There's a variety of these things, one of which is the most important in the world of the appraisal, and that's this one. This is the most important one. I can't say it enough. Most important. I'll make a star, right? So the most important one is highest and best use. This is what the appraiser is trying to determine on that appraisal report. She's saying, is this property being used at its highest and best possible economic use? So the picture we have here on the left is a typical development, and I bet they bought land for that development that looked like the thing on the right. The farm on the right is still in place, and that farmer may not be ready to sell yet. Depending on how valuable those crops are, maybe in certain states where they can grow certain crops that bring in a whole lot more money than your typical soybean. Maybe in Denver or California, they're growing some weed or something. But their decision is, do I want to sell out to the developer and let this be houses? That would really probably be its highest and best use, unless they are growing marijuana, right? So that's the magic question that the appraiser is going to reference and say on the report. She's going to say, in my opinion, this property is being used at its highest and best use as a development or as a farm or whatever the case might actually be. So this is the main principle, the main question that the appraisal is designed to answer. Another one is this. Here's an example of highest and best use. This I think might be in Toronto, and right there in downtown, high rises all around. There's this little pink house. And the question is this little pink house being used at its highest and best possible use economically? Maybe if people spend a lot of money to go through it, maybe it's a tourist attraction, but probably not. What are some potential uses if they tore down this house and built on its footprint instead, that they might do with this lot? Instead of this house being there, what would be a better, higher and better use? There you go. Jack got right down to it. I was originally, when I saw this picture, I thought another building, but parking would probably be better to service all those buildings. So yeah. Then we have the principle of substitution. The idea here is two houses pretty much the same. One is priced lower, will probably sell first, right? All other things being the same, lower price sells first. So principle of substitution, no mystery there. The principle of supply and demand, we're seeing that in a strongly lopsided fashion right now, because currently the inventory, I think I've mentioned the absorption rate, just about a month of inventory. If no other listings were sold or put on the market, no other listings came onto the market as of right now, it would take about a month to sell out of what's out there. And so currently that's a seller's market. We've got a lot of buyers going for a limited number of supply, limited amount of supply. The opposite being this one, a lot of listings and not a lot of buyers. This buyer's market phenomenon is coming. I don't think it'll be in the next year or two, but someday it'll probably flop over to the buyer's market. And in that scenario, we're going to have sellers offering bonuses to agents for selling within 30 days, or giving, paying discount points to the buyer, or extra closing costs to the buyer, all sorts of incentives. I've seen cars, I've seen trips to Disney, all that sort of thing. That's when sellers are in a competitive environment and they have other sellers to beat out for those limited buyers, they get pretty creative. So this law of supply and demand. Then we have the principle of conformity. And in real estate, when it comes to values, it's all about homogeneity, right? Similarity. Things on the right. Those two normal looking square boxy houses probably going to retain value a lot more than this weird octagonal space house on the left, right? These on the left, they're built because supposedly they have better efficiency. There are a few of these houses around in the market. I listed one time. It didn't sell because she wanted to price it the same as similar houses of similar size. The problem is this principle kicks in. The principle of conformity says the buyer's not going to pay the same price for this house. If this house were exactly the same in size and amenities and kitchen being the same level of modernity, is that the word? Modernity. And then like garage, acreage, it still would probably sell for less because it's so unique. Uniqueness is great in people, and when it comes to actors and singers, probably pays you well. But when it comes to real estate, probably not a good value add principle. Another one is this conformity. When this seller on the left puts a sign in the yard and the neighbor on the right, which constantly has 14 cars in the driveway for whatever reason, that might be hard to sell. Some buyers don't want to live next to this car lot. And so there's not much they can do about it unless there's a rule in the covenants and restrictions against it. But this principle of conformity, things that are similar, this house with all the cars is not similar. Therefore, it's affecting the value. Another principle of conformity, and now we're talking aesthetics. Imagine being, I guess living in this house wouldn't be as bad as living across the street from this house, unless you like the colors. But if you looked out and saw this and you're trying to sell yours, you're going to have to sell those potential buyers on looking out across the street and seeing this thing. Or this one. This is my favorite one. I wish I had like a shirt or a necktie of that design. And then, of course, this one. Now we've got neighbors that aren't happy with each other. Bob wants the neighbor to paint the fence, and he finally painted it, but very strategically. And then it usually results in something like this. But this principle of conformity definitely affects the value. Things that are the same tend to retain the value. Then you've got this one, up and coming areas. We can see what's going to be there, but if you look in the background, it's not there yet. It's your typical downtown, off the main drag kind of side streets that have the old buildings, old businesses that show deterioration, show the need for upkeep. But we have this cool Starbucks coming down the road, or whatever else is going to be planned there. Some people like it, some people don't. Some people like the charm of the old buildings, and that's a whole other issue. But anticipation could also be about roads. And right now it's just farmland. But eventually it's going to be a 485 outer loop that crosses over these roads and gonna encircle downtown Charlotte. True story. So this principle of anticipation affects the value. And then, oh, by the way, if you remember back in our first or second week, we talked about what if a buyer agent had a buyer investor who said, look, I know the road's coming through. Go around and knock on the doors. Try to find any landowner in this 1-2 mile radius who wants to sell, because I know they're going to be worth more later when this road gets closer to being finished. And then you're that broker and you go knock on some of these doors of these landowners. Do you have to tell the landowner the reason your buyer wants to buy it is because it's going to be worth more later? You do. Remember that part? So with that principle of anticipation, they may not know what's coming, but your buyer investor does. But you do have that obligation to disclose it. And then the principle of contribution. Some amenities don't help at all. Don't contribute to the value. Pools are sort of a hit or miss. You're going to have to find a buyer that wants a pool. But I once sold a house that was, it was my buyer client, and he was my ex-neighbor, good old guy, old fella that just wanted a simple life. His wife wanted, they wanted a brick house, low maintenance, low upkeep, but the only house we could find that fit their price point and was brick and had a decent sized lot had an above ground pool in the backyard. And he immediately said no, because he actually thought that it was tied into the water system and it would cost more for water, but it would cost more for the treating of the water and cleaning the pool, which he had no time for. His wife would have loved it, but he didn't want it. And so because we had already been looking forever and ever, I thought, well, how in the world can we just put this to rest? And I said, look, if you'll buy this house, I will get rid of the pool. And I did. I rented a Lowe's truck, and I went in there and emptied that water, knocked it down, took it apart. And I live on 5-6 acres, so I had some room off behind a building somewhere. And that pool in its pieces sat in a pile over behind the building for a few years. But it let them buy this property. And in the footprint of that above ground pool, he brought a building in. He bought one from Lowe's or Home Depot. And he was an ex-Boy Scout admin guy. So he had his little camp stove and his little cot, and he had a little camera system. He could see who drove in the driveway, and he'd just hang out in his little building with his AC unit. They had been married for 50 years. I guess that's the key to a long marriage, is separate quarters maybe. But did that add any value or take away? An above ground pool? Probably not so much. An in-ground pool? Probably more so, but probably not as much as you spent to get the pool. Right? I say quite commonly the cheapest way to get a pool is to buy a house that already has one. But if you put one in for $50,000 and all the other houses in the neighborhood that have sold recently sold for $350,000, you're not going to get $400,000 for yours and just tack on that $50,000 on top of what every other house has sold for. So the value of a part of the property is based on its contribution to the entire property. Then we have this principle of competition, and I like to say that McDonald's is never lonely. It never sits there by itself for long. Others come along. Starbucks is an even better example. They have their own competition, another Starbucks. So this concept is that profits attract competition, and too much competition can affect value for sure. Might also look like this: how many similar properties are on the market? And if there's a lot of them, the opposite of our market now, again, those values are going to come down. And right now, there's not a lot of them, so the values are up. And then finally, this principle of change, that on the left is Charlotte, North Carolina, 100 years ago. And then there it is on the right. That's me on the bike on the left side. And then 100 years later, it looks drastically different. No condition remains constant. Things always change. So out of this whole list of what we just considered, what does the appraiser care about the most? I told you already. I gave you the spoiler. Highest and best use. They like to test you on that phrase. Know about the highest and best use. That's what we're looking for when it comes to valuation. There's a process the appraiser follows. And we're studying the appraisal process, even though we're not appraisers, because they do it better. Their process is something we kind of emulate. We just can't call it by the same words. So they're going to look up the specific data, the cost of similar properties, sales that have happened. And if it's an investment property, the income and expenses that that investment property incurs. And then they're going to look outside of that specific property. What's in the neighborhood? Maybe even look at some national and regional stats too. And then what are we here for? The appraiser is going to say, what kind of value or method do I need to do? I need to define the problem. Is this an old church, or is this a single family home that's going to be an owner occupied property? Or is this a rental property, right? So those things matter as to which type of method of valuation they're going to do. Then they do the work. They determine and perform the appropriate scope of the work. They analyze the data, and then they determine that highest and best use. What is this property used for? Is it the most economically highest? Not that it should be used for a different way. It's just economically which way would make it worth more. And then if it's land only, we'll use the sales comparable method, sales comparison method. What other land pieces, what other parcels of land have sold for, and compare them. And how do you compare dirt? Well, zoning. This land, we have to compare what you can do with that dirt. So other things of similar zoning, also other things that might perk or not. Don't forget the septic question. What do we do with the wastewater? A lot of times suspiciously low priced land parcels are low priced because they don't perk anywhere on the lot. In order to perk, it would have to have a $50,000 upgraded system, or maybe that won't even do it. So the land is determined, the value of land is determined by the sales comparison method, as well as residential properties, single family, duplex, tris, and quads. And then out of those three methods of value, the sales comparison method, the cost approach, and the income approach, the appraiser does not average them, never averaged. Always they say, okay, it's going to be this type of property more so. It's not a church, it's a house, and it's not a rental. It's just a house they're going to live in. Therefore, whatever number we came up with in determining the value using the sales comparison method is the best number. We're going to lean more toward it being worth $450 than $470 if we had used the income approach, or $500 when using the cost approach. The main testable feature here is they never get averaged. It's always about weighted estimates, weighted toward the use. And then that final value estimate is given as an appraisal report, an opinion in the form of that appraisal report. Here's those three methods of value again. Sorry, I've got to wait for my animation. I got a little carried away with the animation. This was 5 years ago. I need to probably shut it all down. And then here's our sales comparison approach. Again, single family, even duplexes, triplexes, quads, 1 to 4 units and land we're going to use the sales comparison method, whether appraisers doing it or we brokers. Cost approach is for special use properties, public buildings, churches, schools. Income approach is for income producing properties. You might also see this income approach called the income capitalization capitalization method. Don't let that throw you. It's still the income method. Income capitalization. You'll also see in a minute, we'll get to this thing. Part of that income capitalization method is something called the cap rate. That might be a good way to remember that this is the same thing as the income capitalization or income method. An appraiser will probably use all three whenever possible, and then they will give more weight, never an average. Give more weight to the best use. The best fits the property. Selecting comps. This is the part where you'll actually use in the real world. So we need to pick some similar properties. We would never pick, if the subject property is a 1-story, then the comps should be 1 story, right? Not 2 stories. That's a big difference. Ranch homes, 1-story homes are worth more usually. Why? Well, for one thing, the cost to build. Because if you think about a ranch home, it's going to have to be like a 2,000 square foot ranch, single level. It's got to be on a certain size lot. That 2-story home can be 2,000 feet, but in an upstairs and a downstairs. And so it could be half the size lot. It's also lower or less materials. It's less roofing because the roof only needs to be big enough for 1,000 feet because they're stacked. The roof needs to be bigger for the 2,000 square foot one. And then what else?
More labor cost and like money for the base when you prepare.
Right. Exactly right. So 1 stories should only be compared to 1 stories, for instance. Other things like this, when they were sold. When did they sell? Recency is huge. An appraiser won't use something that's sold more than a month or 2 ago. And that could be challenging if we're out in the country and it's maybe like a log cabin home on 27 acres. True story. I had that listing. A log home, 27 acres. It had a 16 by 16 foot 2-story log hunting cabin that the owner and his wife built at 65 years old and 70 years old. They hauled those logs and they built it on top of a mountain. It was truly off grid. It had its own little septic tank. It had its own little water tank. That was in the back. The main home was at the street, and that was the log home. How the heck do you value this thing? Well, I had to pick and choose. I had to cut and paste. And so I looked in the similar area of things that have sold, and I looked at homes, not just necessarily log homes, but similar size houses by square footage and amenities. And then I said, okay, well then how much is land? How much is an acre worth? How much is 10, 15, 20 acre parcels worth? By the way, the dollars per acre is higher for smaller parcels, right? It just works out that way. The larger the parcel, 20 acres plus, for instance, it's going to be smaller, less dollars per acre. So there's those factors. You need to compare the size of the lot. You can't just say how much is $1 per acre on this 1 acre piece of land if you're comparing it to 27. Because the dollars per acre on the 27 is not going to sell for as much per acre. So all of that came into play. I had to cut and paste. And in that case, I'll see if I have pictures still left over from it. It was several years ago. He was a family friend, the dad of a school friend. He had listed it for 1.5 years without me. He had hired an agent who just came in there and said, what do you want to sell this for? And he had built that cabin up in the woods. The original farmhouse had burned down, and this log home was to replace that. So it was a very emotional, had a bunch of old buildings laying around, barns, and buildings that weren't in great shape, but they were useful, functional, had a stream and a little pond. So a very unique property. And he said, how about 800,000? And she said to herself, probably, I really need a listing. I want this listing. I'll just tell this guy yes. And surely it will eventually sell, but it didn't. It sat for a year. And then finally, somebody talked him into dropping it by 100. And then another agent came along. Hers expired. A new agent came, and that agent got him down to 650 by the time he was fed up. And his son said, call Neil. He'll at least tell you the truth, and he won't just shoot you a line. And I did. I came in there. I did my work, my research, cut and pasted. And the best I could come up with, legit, supported by data, was that it was worth $400,000. This was a very rough, gruff kind of mountain folks couple, and I knew them growing up, so they felt comfortable around me. You better believe my ears were bleeding by the end of that appointment. Not mad at me, just mad at the situation. So they were just burning it up, talking about blah, 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 and this and that. And we put all this blood, sweat, and tears, and you're right, exactly right. But all I can do is report to you what similar properties have sold for. And we went on the market, and within maybe 3 or 4 months, we got a buyer who drove by it and called me on the sign. I was actually ended up being a dual agent. And I did not give that buyer advice on what he should offer because I can't. I'm a dual agent. I gave him some comps, just some, I don't even know if I did that. He didn't even want to. He said, we finally went back and forth and landed on $400,000. Because when I told them it was worth 400 a few months earlier, they said, well, Neil, you know, we've been at 650 for a while. How about we list it at 500? And I said, okay, just understand that I don't think it'll sell for that. So I took it at 500. I did not lie to them. So it wasn't that I did that whole willful misrepresentation thing. That would have been if I said, I know I can get 500 for it. I told him 400. I agreed to try marketing it at 5, and we ended up at 4. And because I was a dual agent, it worked out because I ended up just taking one side of the commission just to pull it all together. In fact, we got to the point where he wouldn't come below 425 and the other guy wouldn't come above 400. And so instead of me charging 24,000, I just charged 12,000 on commission, and it all kind of worked out there. So this thing's kind of the valuation can get real tricky. What would you do if you were the broker in that situation and there's no neighborhoods with houses, with log houses and 27 acres in them? I guess one thing you could do is talk that owner into getting an appraisal. That's a valid solution, but that appraiser is going to do kind of what we did. They're going to just pick and choose and look for comps, and that's just part of that process. So other important features of the comps needs to be similar in age, proximate location, same neighborhood if possible. You don't want to go too far out, no more than a mile or 2 out radius. And then you'd want to make a note of it and say, this wasn't in the exact same neighborhood, but there's no comps in this neighborhood. I had to go out a little further. And so then how does that neighborhood compare to this one? Maybe make adjustments for those differences and those physical characteristics too. It also needs to have sold in a similar situation. So if the comparable was a foreclosure and the subject is not, then we can't use foreclosure comps to figure the value of the subject because the foreclosure is going to sell for less, and that won't work. So we've got to consider that too. Distress sales can't be compared to non-distress sales. And that also includes estate sales. It says in the MLS if it's sold because it was an estate. That affects the value. One time I had one that comped out, or I sold it. Let me think. I don't remember the exact numbers, but the appraisal came in, let's say like $12,000 lower than the contract price. And one of the comps that the appraiser used, this was a 2-story home. One of the comps was a ranch around the corner. that was bigger, significantly bigger, like maybe 700 square feet bigger. Not a great comp that this official professional appraiser used. And it was so suspiciously lower priced than our subject contract price that I called the listing agent from when it sold a month ago. And I said, hey, listing agent, just curious, got one right now that appraised, and it appraised lower than our contract, but it's using this as a comp. Just curious, what went on with this property when you sold it, when you closed on this thing? And they said, oh, well, it was an estate sale. It did not mention that in the MLS. The appraiser didn't make any sort of adjustment for that. It just got missed. And also on top of that, the heirs sold it to their friend. It's already the case that heirs just kind of usually want to dump and run and get the most money they can quickly because they're not in love with the property. They're not trying to just squeeze for every little drop. But then when they also sell it to their buddy, they're probably going to give them the friendly family discount, right? So that's what I said. I told the buyer agent, I said, this is what I learned. And she wanted it to work too. So she and I kind of worked together to put this appeal of the appraisal together. When the appraisal comes in lower than the contract price, there's an appeal process. Ideally, you don't want to go there. You want to make sure the appraiser gets it right the first time, but sometimes they just don't. But that appeal process, you do not, as a broker, call the appraiser anymore. Once the appraisal is done, that appeal process has to be run through the lender. And you tell the lender, here's the comps I think the appraiser might have missed, or here's the features and benefits they might not have given full credit for, and could you ask the appraiser to please tell us how they came up with their number? You definitely don't call the appraiser. Not allowed to. Can't do it. So, whether it's an appraisal or whether it's a CMA or BPO done by a broker, 3 to 4 comps are generally good enough, considered good enough. If a lender wants the appraiser to get another comp because it's just too close for them to feel comfortable being sure of the value, they'll ask for it. But usually 3 to 4 works. The best source of comps, you probably would know this, the MLS. It's going to be the most detail. We've seen that before. I think I've shared the MLS with you. And we've got all these details, the square feet, the bedrooms, all the paragraph talking about the condition, paint, new heating and air system, new water heater. If there is no comps in the MLS, then tax records could work, but it's going to be more agonizing, painstaking to go through and kind of find them and look for them. And they can be flawed. Quite often the square footage is not right. On the tax record, it's usually smaller, which means that the aggregators, the algorithm online estimators, if it's a small square footage for the sale price that's reported, guess what? They're using an abnormally high price per square foot, which is another reason that they're wrong significantly so much of the time, because they're working off of bad data. The owner doesn't usually correct the square footage in the tax record because they're paying tax based on a value, the tax value based on that square footage. Therefore, they don't want to change that. They want their taxes to be lower. So it results in a database that's not accurate. So the best comps, what do you think the number one best feature, most important feature of a good comparable sale would be? Most important when you're picking comps. You're going through the MLS trying to figure out, what do I pick to compare this subject property to?
From same neighborhood?
That's a good one. Yep. Same neighborhood.
Recently sold?
There it is. That's the most important one. Recent sales. I had one where I went into contract with a, she was a first-time buyer originally that I helped, and then she wanted to sell that one and buy another one, and so we did. And at the time, the market was really just starting to take off, and the price was $195, the list price. We had to compete with a couple competing offers, and we ended up at $196. And looking back, it's just almost laughable to think about competing offers that it got to the point of, I mean, heck, some of them nowadays would have probably gone 100,000 over asking price. But we ended up a little more than asking price. The day after under contract, she called near tears, almost crying. Her dad had taken a look at the contract. He had done some research, and he said, I am not seeing that it's worth this. I think it's worth less. I'm worried that you're paying too much. And he got her in a huge uproar. She was really upset and scared. But thankfully, I had the relationship established, helping her once before. And I talked her off the ledge, and I'm like, look, I'm glad you have your dad and your mom. They're very involved. And sometimes you have to say nice things. It's good to have counsel, but I'm just curious, what comps did dad use? What do you think the comps were that dad used? He got his comps online. Of course, he didn't have MLS access. And his comps from a certain online resource and some tax data were from when? A year ago. Of course, the sales were lower a year ago. He had even one that was 2 years ago. He had terrible comps. An appraiser would never use those comps. So I had to very politely say, oh, well, this is not a mystery now. I get this, and I can appreciate that he did the best he could with what he had. But just so you know, an appraiser is not going to use these comps. There's no way in the world an appraiser would ever use these comps from a year ago. That's why when we decided what price to offer last week, when we were doing all this together, you and me, that I did the most recent comps, and I picked some that sold in the last month, because that's what an appraiser is going to do. And I say that word a lot. That's what an appraiser is going to do. So the best comps are the recent comps, the ones that are close geographically, the ones that are similar type, like 1 versus 2 story. Another issue of type is that whole concept of a tri-level, where you've got that level below the ground, tri-level like I live in, and you've got some bedrooms up and you've got some down, and you're living on the stairs. So to compare that to a 2-story or even a ranch, you kind of can't. It's hard to compare a tri-level. It's sort of an outdated floor plan. Tri-levels are just their own little animal, and if all you have to compare it to is a 2-story, that's better at least than a ranch. It's probably not going to sell for those same prices. So I just make an adjustment in my CMA when I tell the seller, look, seller, you're living in a tri-level or a split level, and they're just sort of, I live in 1, 2, and I get it. The market doesn't support it. Always blame the market as the bad guy. The market gives more money to 2 stories and 1 stories. They don't tend to favor the tri-levels. So that's an important piece too. Similar size, because again, the fewer adjustments you make, the more accurate your number is going to be. And in a moment, we're going to talk about making those adjustments. But if we have a comparable that's 2,500 square feet, but the subject is 2,000 square feet, then we need to give a dollar amount to account for that 500 square foot of difference. But if we can pick a different comparable that is only 2,200 square feet, now we just need an adjustment to account for 200 feet of difference. So if everything else is the same between these two comps, it's better to use this one because we're making a smaller adjustment. And the adjustments is where the errors can come in, right? That's where the guesswork comes in. We certainly wouldn't want one that's like 1,000 square feet off, or sorry, 1,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet off. That would be a huge adjustment that would allow for all sorts of potential error. So all that factors in. Amenities and updates like appliances, hardwood floors, granite countertops, kitchen upgrades, bathroom upgrades. Those are big as well. Let's go ahead and take our break. We'll come back and talk more about making these adjustments. let's talk about this. Who knows what this guy is? Who is this?
Heisman.
You got it. Why do I use the Heisman Trophy for this topic? Because the phrase is arm's length transactions only. The concept, again, where no conflict of interest. We can't pick comps that have some sort of a conflict of interest. We need to pick comps that are similar. So family selling to family, you might assume that there might be a bit of a discount there, perhaps, or friends to friends, or estate sales, that kind of thing. So arm's length transactions, all comps that you consider need to have been at arm's length. Let's talk about the making of adjustments. It comes down to these two words. Compared to the subject property, is the subject property superior or inferior to the subject? Is it an item that's more than or less than the subject property? So in the case of a garage, the subject has a 3-car garage. Oops. There we go. Three cars. The comp has a 4-car garage. We need to make an adjustment. We need to make it because we know this comparable sold for $200,000, but it had more garages. And so we need to see what it theoretically would have sold for if it had 3-car garage, because that's the comparables, a number of garages. That's what we need to figure the value of. Therefore, how much is a garage worth? And on this test, they'll probably tell you. On the test, they'll say, by the way, one garage is worth $10,000 or whatever they say. They'll probably tell you. And so if that's the case, 3-car garage on the subject, 4-car garage on the comparable, are we going to do what? What are we going to do with that $10,000? Are we going to add it or subtract it from what that comparable sold for?
Subtract.
Why?
To make it comparable to a 3-car.
You got it. Because 4 is higher than 3. And we've got to bring it down to a 3. So you can even use your hand sitting there taking the test if you need to. Think subject comparable is higher. We need to bring the comparable down, so to subtract money from what the comparable sold for. So that just means that we're going to say that everything else being the same, instead of $200,000, this comparable with a 3-car garage would sell for $190,000. And we just do that for every adjustment. There probably won't be a ton of adjustments you have to deal with in this class or on this test. They'll keep it pretty streamlined, but I could see a garage. I could see maybe certainly square feet. I could see a bathroom or a bedroom. Although in real life, we don't really adjust for bedrooms and bathrooms as much as we do square feet. So we would maybe make it rarely do I do that. I just say, I'm already trying to compare things with similar bathrooms and bedrooms anyway. But on the test, they'll give you the parameters that you need. Here's the other thing that people can get wrong sometimes. Be careful and only adjust the comp. You never adjust the subject. In real life, we've got this subject property and we don't know what it's going to sell for. That's why we're trying to do this math. We're trying to figure out what is it worth. Or I guess for us brokers, we're trying to figure out what's the probable sale price. But we do know that this first comp sold for $155,900. The second comp sold for $157,100. And the third comp sold for $158,300. And we're going to make adjustments to each of these comps and then factor them in to figure out how close did comp 1 match up to the subject versus comp 2 versus comp 3. Maybe if comp 3 had more of the similar features, we're going to give a little more weight to that $158,300, right? Sort of like what the appraiser does with the different methods of valuation. But what we don't ever do is adjust the subject price. We don't know that price. It's a mystery. You can't add or subtract from a question mark. We don't know what it's going to sell for. So therefore, the only thing you can adjust is the comp. Just be looking for that on the test as its own sort of question. Tom is trying to do a CMA for this property, and comp 1 sold for this and comp 2 for that. What should he do for this adjustment for the 1 bathroom difference? A, adjust the subject by $3,000. Add $3,000 to the subject. Or B, the comp, add $3,000 to the comp, or some other version of similar questions. This will always be the wrong answer because you never adjust the subject, right? That's what we're talking about. Two types of comps can't be used. What would we not use to figure out what a property might sell for? What types of properties are irrelevant, not useful at all, when we're determining what something might be projected to sell for? I'll give you some choices. In the MLS, we have actives, we have solds, we have under contracts, we have expireds, we have withdrawns. Out of all of these, which is the best type of comp to pick from to determine what somebody might pay for a similar house? There you go. So solds are the best kind for sure. Yeah. What are the two that we can't use? I'll take these off the table because they didn't do anything, right? Expired and withdrawn, they gave up. But actives and under contracts, we don't care what actives are. We kind of do, but not for this purpose. Actives don't matter in determining what it might sell for. Actives do matter in noticing and making a note of how competitive the market is, and also pricing, list price strategy. So actives matter when you're trying to figure out what to ask for the property, because then we get into how many actives are there in the 400 to 450 range compared to the 450 to 500 range. And so if there's 13 in that lower range, but 35 in the higher range, it might be smart to probably price it either here or less because we have less competition, right? So there's that. But actives, in terms of determining what a buyer would pay, you don't know what a buyer would pay by looking at the actives. I call the actives with the list price, I call it the wish price. Because it could just be like my friend with the 27-acre property that started out asking $800,000. He hoped and wished for it. It was not supported by data. And unfortunately, houses that are listed in the MLS can just be listed in the MLS without any proof, without any real research. The agent might eventually get in trouble, but agents buy listings all the time. I say it that way. I say buy listings because there's agents that are so desperate to get a listing, they'll say, yes, seller, whatever you say, ma'am, I'll list it at whatever price because I want to get my sign in the yard. And so we don't know which ones are like that unless we do the research ourselves. So these two cannot be used, actives and under contracts. Why not under contract ones? Why can't we go by the under contract prices? What do you think? Why not under contract?
You don't know what it's going to sell for yet.
Yeah, because they can't report it. We're not allowed to report what it went under contract for. Yeah, it's sort of still active because any minute it could go back off the market. It could fail to close, and then it would be back active again. But the main thing is we still don't know the sale price for either one of these. We're not allowed to report it when it's under contract because it could go back active again. And then we would have disclosed what the seller was willing to take, and that would harm the seller. So these never are going to be used to determine what it probably would sell for. They are useful. I do actually use them in helping to establish our strategy for a list price and our marketing, but not for determining actual probable sale price. Once they close, we will. And sometimes I've done a CMA where we had a great comp that was under contract, and I noticed that it went under contract 3 weeks ago. And maybe I'm going to put my listing up in another couple of weeks. And so I kind of think to myself, gosh, I really hope this closes before we go on the market, because I would love to factor in what they sell for, and that's going to give us a good idea of what we could expect. So they are useful, but just for other reasons. The main objective is to make the comp as similar to the subject as possible. So the best practice is to make as few adjustments as possible. And that's going to require finding things that are already as close and similar as we can. We as brokers need to try. We've got to put forth an effort. We have to be competent in this effort. We can't just throw it at the wall and see what sticks. Guess what? In the last 5 years, a lot of agents threw it at the wall and saw what stuck. We didn't have to be that good at pricing, because we had 35 competing offers and sometimes 83. And somebody in the class the other day said 98 competing offers on one property. So you don't really have to be great at pricing when that's the case. We have kind of settled out a little bit. Now I call this year sort of last year junior. It's not as crazy. So we do need to be better at pricing than we used to have to be. And if we don't do it competently, or if we tell them, yeah, sure, it'll sell for what you want. You want 500, but I think, and I've done my research, and this is your thoughts in your head, I think it's going to be 400, but I'm going to tell you and support your 500 so you don't hire the guy down the street. You'll hire me instead. That is actionable, right? That's now willful misrepresentation. Now you've done something wrong that you could possibly get in trouble for once that seller, in 5 months of inactivity, realizes you gave them bad advice. They might just make a complaint, and the commission could indeed take disciplinary action against you. Here's another $5 vocabulary word. Just know that the word correlation is sort of like the equal sign. You've made all the adjustments of all the different comps, and once all of those are made, you're using them to determine that probable sales price range, you, the broker. And this process is called correlation. That's what you're doing when you're figuring out the final, here's what I think it'll probably sell for. Okay. So here's a potential problem. We've got a subject property. Oh, by the way, I forgot to do the little screen share trick. Tell me again if you think it looks better if I do it this way. Does that look better or worse? Now I can't see you guys. Hang on a second. Is that
It's a
clear?
better view for me.
Jack says worse. Alfred says better. Interesting. Zoom, what are you doing? Is it getting any better? Still bad? Is it like pixelated or something? Still read it, but it's just not as clear. Interesting. Huh.
Well, you can adjust your own view option. So if you see the drop down, click it, and you can make it look different. Like I got it full screen.
Yeah, that's true. Let me know if it's not readable at all, and we'll go back. But let's see, just kind of trying to experiment and figure out the best way. Subject property has 2 bedrooms. The comparable property has 3 bedrooms. The estimated value of a bedroom is $2,500. According to the sales comparison method, what should the appraiser do? So we don't have to do any math here, really. We just have to know what to do with the numbers. And we've got a subject which has 2 bedrooms and a comparable which has 3 bedrooms. So it's more than. And so we need to bring it down to the level of the subject, which means we need to subtract. And so we're going to look for the thing that says deduct. And we can weed out 2 of the 4 answer choices. The next thing is deduct how much and from what. So deduct, We also already know that we deduct from the comp, never the subject. So now we know two things, and then it's the $2,500. So let's see, deduct 25 from the value of the subject? No, can't do that. Add? No, we already know no add because we are coming down. And then deduct 25 from the value of the comp. Let's see, there we go. It's C. That's the one. Does that make sense? Pretty straightforward. What about this? A subject property has a 2-car garage. A comparable property down the street sold for $245 a month ago and is superior to the subject by having a 3-car garage, but everything else is the same. The broker figures the value of a 1-car garage adjustment to be $5,000. So what's the probable sale price of the subject property? I like to make little notes. So let's see, this comparable sold for $245. That's what we're going to add or subtract from. And then it's got a 3-car garage, whereas the subject has a 2-car garage. Sort of like what we just were messing around with. So we're going to need to subtract. Superior comp means subtract. S for superior, S for subtract. Subtract the money from it. So how much are we subtracting? $5,000. So theoretically that subject, or theoretically the comparable with 2-car garage would have sold for $240 instead of the $245. Is that okay? You might get into one where they also talk about bedrooms, bathrooms, square feet, and now you've got to add and subtract along the way. And so that's just a matter of keeping up with things. I don't think they do more than 2 or 3 of these to you. So don't get too concerned that it's going to turn into like a monster math problem or something. And then this one, subject property has 2.5 bathrooms. A house in the same neighborhood sold for $175 last week. It is inferior to the subject by having 2 bathrooms instead of 2.5. Everything else is the same. The broker figures the value of a full bath is $3,000 and a half bath is $1,500. By the way, in real life, there's not a half relationship. It's not a 1 to 1/2 relationship. A half bath is probably worth more like $2,000 or maybe $2,500 compared to that $3,000. But for our purposes, we're going with this. What's the probable sale price of the subject? How much are we coming down between the comparable and the subject? A half bath worth. And so actually what we need to do is what? Are we adding or subtracting from the comparable sale price? If the comparable is inferior, we need to add instead of subtract. So we're going to add $1,500 for that half bath difference to get $176.5. We okay there? Good. So that's basically the comparable method. It's just adding and subtracting from the comparable, never the subject. They'll give you what you need for making those adjustments. And the main other thing is superior versus inferior. If it says the comparable is superior, subtract. Bring the number down. Bring that sale price down. Let's talk about the cost approach. When it's a unique property, it's not single family, duplex, triplex, quads. It's not 1 to 4 unit, single family, any of that stuff. And it's not land. If it's a unique property, church, school, government building, something like that. There's no neighborhoods full of those things. Therefore, we use the principle of substitution. We are figuring out the value of it to build it brand new because it's so unique. But then we're acknowledging that it's not new. Maybe it's 40 years old. And so how much has it depreciated over those 40 years? We need to figure out that new price to build and then subtract an amount for depreciation. So we're acquiring an equally desirable, valuable substitute property. That's the part where we're figuring the new cost into the mix. And then first step out of 5, figure out the value of the land. Especially with properties like these, they're going to be, several acres probably. So let's deal with the land price, land amount of value first, and say, well, it's on 10 acres. So how much do 10 acres, how much are they worth? How much does that sell for? So that's step 1, sort of carve out the land from the mix. Well, we went through a lot of pages. And estimate that land value using the CMA, the last method, the market analysis method, the sales comparison method. Because land can't be depreciated. We're not going to want to depreciate the land value because land doesn't depreciate. We only depreciate the structures. And so get that land separate. 10 acres at, let's say, 10 acres at $20,000 per acre. So what's that? $200,000 would be our estimated land value. So we're going to leave that alone, set that off to the side. That next step, the cost of building the building brand new, all the building and improvements just themselves as if they were floating in midair. How much would it cost to build it? That's going to be what we do next. Then we say it's not new. We've got to match it up to the subject, which is 40 years old. How much are we going to subtract from the new cost, new value? If it were new, subtract from that an amount to allow for the depreciation. And then add the land amount back in to the depreciated construction cost value to get the total property value. So there's a couple of other issues here. Let's look at this first. Then we'll talk about reproduction costs. But this was in the book at one point. I'm not sure if it's still in the book that you have, but it accomplishes the same purpose. Here is an example of a cost approach method. We've got a land valuation determination here. 60 by 135 at $450 per front foot. They're choosing to use front footage as their estimator of value. And so that comes out to being worth $27,000. And then they add in some improvements like just driveway, sidewalks, landscaping for another $8,000 for the total improved land cost or value of $35,000. So that's done first, just the land part. Now we're going to work with the building. It's a 1,500 square foot building, and we've done our research and determined that to build that brand new would cost $65 per square foot. This is clearly an old example. So at $65 a square foot at 1,500 feet, $97,500 to build this new. But because this building we're dealing with has some problems, it needs some paint. So let's deduct $4,000. It's got some structural deterioration. So let's deduct $9,750. It's got something called functional obsolescence. That means maybe some old design features that cause it to be functionally less than. It could also be like a 5-bedroom home with only 1 bathroom from 80 years ago. That's functional obsolescence. So allowing for all of that, we're subtracting another 2. We're subtracting a total of $15,750. From what? From the 97.5, not from the 35 as well. So we're taking the 97.5 and subtracting that depreciation estimate, all those figures, to get 81,750 over here. Now we're going to add that 35,000 for the land back to this to get an estimate of value using the cost approach of 116,750. Make sense? I know that's the first time, and I know it's like kind of a lot, But that's the idea. Just those 5 steps. I don't think they go too crazy in testing you on this. 1 second. There we go. So there it is. The land, then the cost to build it new, then the depreciation subtracted from that, and then the land added back in. How do we estimate the building cost? There are 3 possible methods an appraiser would use. We, by the way, as brokers, we're probably not going to do this too much unless you're a commercial specialist, in which case, if it's a big enough project, I probably would just hire an appraiser and get their opinion rather than try to figure it out myself. So don't think you have to just do this on the regular daily basis. But one method of estimating a new construction build cost is the square foot method, which is what appraisers typically use, appraisers compared to contractors. And that's just strictly the cost per square foot times the number of square feet. They've done their research. They know that a government building like this one costs $500 a square foot. I just pulled that from air. I have no idea. And so how big is it? 10,000 square feet. So $500 per square foot times 10,000 square feet. That sounds like a crazy number. Let's just see what it is for fun. Let's say 500 per square foot times 10,000. Yeah, $5 million. That sounds about right for a government building. That might not be too far off. So the square foot method, just $1 per square foot times the number of square feet, is one of the possible ways. It's the most common as well. Going to use that more than anything else. Then we've got a couple of other methods that a contractor would tend to use. One of them is called the quantity survey method. This is more of a vocabulary word thing than it is knowing how to do this thing. So the quantity survey is about quantities, right? Quantities of raw materials. It's just purely how much lumber do I need to build this 10,000 foot building? How much concrete? How much sheetrock? How much whatever? And then how much will it cost for the labor to install it? It's really sort of like it almost reminds me of a modular home, right? A modular home is like 2 or 3 pieces, and they bring those in. So the quantity survey method is like the piece that represents the various quantities of all the materials, and then the piece that represents the labor required to put all of that together. That's the quantity survey method. And then the other optional choice to figure out how much this thing is worth to build brand new is the unit in place method, where it's estimating the cost per unit of the different components, like the framing. Framing is going to cost this much. The foundation is going to cost this much. The roofing, this much. The finished stages of things, this much. So the various pieces of the construction cost per unit of the components is what this is all about. So again, the price per square foot is probably the most commonly used one that you'd run into. But those are the 3 possible methods of figuring out how much it would cost to build this thing new. And then when it comes to depreciation, that's just representing a loss in value, right? Depreciation could be physical deterioration because the roof is now bad, the paint is peeling down to the wood, and you have some curable types of depreciation, but you also have some incurable types. So curable would include repainting it, putting on a new roof. Those are fixable. Curable means fixable. But incurable, meaning in terms of it being cost prohibitive, might be load-bearing walls or foundations. It'd be a lot more expensive to put in more load-bearing walls, more foundations. Maybe you can't even get down into the basement with the size of beams you would need to improve and beef up the foundation. So that would be considered incurable because it's sort of cost prohibitive. When you see VIP, it's more of a commonly likely to be seen on the test type of thing. So curable versus incurable is important. And then functional obsolescence means there's some sort of undesirable feature. And something residentially that I think about to be a functional obsolescence thing is what's called a sunken living room. You don't see those a lot. You know what I mean by a sunken living room? There's a neighborhood near my house that has golf course houses, little courtyard houses, and they're all single story. So they draw the attention of people that have mobility issues, maybe older people, maybe disabled people. But the problem is they've got these darn sunken living rooms, which might look something like this. The whole house is one level, but you got to take a couple steps down into the living room section. So that would be an example of functional obsolescence, right? It's sort of a thing they used to do, they don't do anymore, that could affect the value. So some sort of undesirable feature. And then it could be a curable thing, like functional obsolescence, outdated fixtures. That's easy. Might be expensive, but it's easy. Swap them out. Plumbing, maybe it's only plumbed for a 1-bedroom. Room conversions, maybe it's 6 bedrooms, 1 bath. So maybe turn one of those bedrooms into a bath. But maybe it's a situation where that's even incurable, and it's 5 bedrooms, 1 bath, and there's really no real way to add a bath without significant expense, without going outside of the footprint, adding a roof, adding a foundation, and so that would be considered incurable. Or no air conditioning, because to install the ducts would be too expensive. I live in this little tri-level house, and the attic space is just enough to be in a seated position. It's probably maybe 3 to 4 feet high up there. So I just got to crawl around up there to get to the heating and air unit. And the guys that installed it, gosh, back in 2008, were not thrilled for my job because they had to do all that stuff in this cramped attic space. If it were much worse than that, it had to be a significantly large unit that might be considered incurable in this situation. And then economic depreciation means it's an uncontrollable thing because you're too close to the landfill or too close to the hog farm or something that's a pollution or a noise or an odor kind of nuisance. And it is never curable, always incurable. So I could see a test question being this: which of the following types of depreciation are never curable? Physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, or economic? And the answer would be economic, because it's never curable. It's always incurable. It's outside of your control. It's the person down the street that owns that hog farm, that landfill, and they're not moving, and you can't make them. And so you are subject to it being there, unfixable. So there's 2 things that cannot ever be depreciated, and that's land or dirt, as well as a personal residence. We never depreciate a personal residence. This cost approach is mostly for non-personal residences, right? Churches, schools, government buildings. There's one way of handling this depreciation is some combination of something called the effective age and the economic life of the property. And they will just take that straight line depreciation from up here to down here and say, over time, over the 40 years this building existed, it depreciated from this down to that. Declines from 100% down to 0% at an even rate, even though that's not what had happened in real life. The paint was good probably for the first 15 years, and then it started deteriorating from there. But for the purposes financially on paper, a straight line method of depreciation is what they would probably use. A couple other terms to know: the effective age is the age placed on the building by an appraiser saying, look, I know this building is 50 years old, but they replaced the heating and air system, the water heater, the doors and windows, and therefore its effective age is more like 5 years old. It's 50 years old chronologically. It was born 50 years ago, like me. My chronological age, 52. My effective age, 72, because I'm a little sore when I get out of bed. No, I would give myself less than. But building, because they've done upgrades, that effective age is less than the actual age. The appraiser will always acknowledge that actual chronological age, but they'll also say, because of the condition of the mechanicals and the structural and everything I've witnessed, the effective age is this. And it's a good sign when it's less than the chronological. If it's more than, it probably needs to be torn down. So again, special use buildings, public buildings, government buildings, this is not, cost approach is not for income producing property. And these aren't common regular sales that pop up all the time. So we don't have comps to use. We can't use the sales comparison method. And then out of the three approaches to value, the sales comparison, the cost, and the income one that we'll see in a minute, this cost approach will always produce the highest value of a property because they're starting with the new construction cost and then they're depreciating it from there. So it tends to just be always the highest. And it doesn't even matter unless it's that kind of structure, that kind of sale. One of those types of properties that we saw back here. Let me see here. One more thing. I almost skipped it. Within this cost approach, there's two things to consider: the reproduction cost of a element versus the replacement cost of an element. So think about a historic property. A historic house. Holy cow, time is flying, guys. You may not think so, but I do. That historic house front door on that Victorian home is gorgeous, right? Somebody handmade that thing once upon a time. Let me see here. And it might look like this. That one looks pretty fancy. All that inlaid stained glass. There it is. Or some ornate wooden version of it. Like this. Somebody did that by hand once upon a time. Where'd it go? Or something similar. So you don't just go to Lowe's. Look at the price. I mean, there's $1,300, $1,200. You don't just go to Lowe's and buy this thing off the rack. This is a custom made piece or something like that. And so that would be where we get into reproduction cost instead of replacement cost, because reproduction is an exact replica at the current prices to replicate it. Typically historic. Replacement cost, if you just need a front door, go to Lowe's and buy a $300 front door. But if you need it to match the house, because the historic zoning requires it to match the house, you better not come here with that Lowe's front door. If it's in the historic district, they're going to write you up. They're going to fine you. So that now it's going to be a $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 door. The reproduction cost is more than the replacement cost. Placement costs are more commonly used using modern materials and methods, just functional rather than form, rather than pretty. Okay, cranking it out. Got 10 minutes to go tonight. Let's get into the third approach called the income approach. Some of you will be very interested in this because it's real world applicable to an investment property. And if you're thinking about getting your real estate license, I think some of you already told me that you were doing so for the investment piece of the expertise. So we are not so worried about how much things like this one have sold for, like we were when we did the sales comparison method. We're more concerned with what is the present worth of the future rights to income. In other words, what can we rent it for the next 5 years? One by one, month by month. And so that matters more. We're going to look at that gross potential income. We're going to look at the expenses that we have to pay for this property, because every property has them. And so the income derived from the property controls the value more so than what similar ones have sold for. So if it's a rental property, it's about the income. And it could be as small as a little duplex and as large as a shopping center or an office building or a high rise or a skyscraper. So here's the acronym. The acronym I've color coded to help you see where the letters fit a little better. It looks worse than it is. It just makes sense in real life. Some of you have probably already messed with something like this. The first part of the equation we're looking at is this given acronym. Gross income, the most you could possibly earn on it. So if it's a 100-unit apartment building, 100 units, and they rent for $2,000 a piece, then we've got potential of $200,000 per month of income. Gross income potential. Problem is, in real life, not everybody pays on time and not everybody stays the whole time. And so you've got this thing called vacancy that could very well factor into the mix, and we need to allow for. So that's what we're doing there, is subtracting out for the fact that it's a 5% vacancy rate, or 4 or 6 or 9 or whatever. So that's part of looking at the financial statements provided by the seller. Hey, seller, what's your vacancy rate? How many of these 100 units are rented right now? And then maybe out of the 100, 96 are rented, but 3 of them are slow to pay. And so you're having to use a collections agency to collect or something. So it's basically vacancy plus collections is represented by this number. So it's not that you're necessarily getting 200,000 a month, and we would extrapolate that out to the whole year. What would this look like for the whole year? 200,000 for the month times 12 months. This is a $2.4 million potential gross income for the year. So once we do that and take out for vacancy, we now have to take out for the other big boy, big girl things in life that we learned when we first went out on our own. We have to pay bills, and those expenses for an investment property amount to what? Tell me in the chat. What sort of expenses are we talking about for an investment property? Maybe specifically an apartment complex. I'll give you one. Utilities. What's another one? Whole big complex. Oh yeah, taxes, maintenance. There you go. Maintenance, taxes. And if it's a complex like that, you might have an on-site manager. You might have a repair person. You might have to just hire repair companies. You might have housekeeping. All sorts of things can pop up. Maybe maintaining the parking lot and keeping that repaved. So it could get pretty elaborate. So once you take that gross potential income, subtract out the vacancy rate, subtract out the operating expenses, that leaves you with this thing called NOI that I'm sure if you've ever touched anything to do with investment property or a course or a book, you've heard of NOI, the net operating income. Here's an important point to mention. Out of these expenses, there's something very important to note that is not included in the expenses. We looked at maintenance and utilities and taxes, and the only thing we didn't talk about was something we learned in finance or in the finance chapter, and that's debt service. The P&I, principal and interest, the payment, the loan amount. Why not? Net operating income does not include debt service. That way we can compare things more apples to apples, and it becomes irrelevant how someone chose to own it. Whether they choose to pay all cash versus have a mortgage is irrelevant to the NOI. All the operating expenses do not include debt service when we're calculating NOI. So let's look at the relationship of what NOI actually is. We take that gross income, we take out the, let's say a 5% vacancy. That gives what we call an effective gross income. We take out the operating expenses, not including the mortgage. Also insurance, that's one that we didn't think about and mention a minute ago. And then that leaves us this NOI that looks like this. Oh, first of all, Why are mortgage expenses not included in operating expenses? Because the appraiser always assumes a cash purchase. Therefore, those mortgage expenses aren't relevant to this calculation at all. The NOI is related to this thing called a capitalization rate. And a cap rate is just the rate that helps an investor compare different investment properties. That's what they use to realize that return on their investment. So it's sort of the yield. It's the yield of the property that an investor expects for investing in this type of building. So you could have an office building compared to an industrial building. And if the investor is trying to decide which thing do I want to invest in, one thing he's going to discover in their homework that he does with his agent might say, the cap rate of the office building is around 8%. The cap rate of the industrial building is around 6%. I don't know if these are real numbers, but I'm just showing you that capitalization rate is something that is related to net operating income. Let's see how it's related. The net operating income, do it down here. Net operating income as to a T formula is a product of the cap rate times the market value or sale price of the property. In other words, if you know the net operating income by looking at the financials, and you know the cap rate for similar properties like this office complex or industrial warehouse or whatever it is, then you can divide NOI by cap rate, and it'll give you an approximate estimate of what the value of the property is. So it goes any way, any sort of T formula, we can use any of the numbers. If we know that the property's sold, if we're looking at comparables that have sold similar office parks or office buildings, and we know that they tended to sell for an average of $3 million. And we also know the net operating income for these buildings on average has been, I'm just pulling from places right now. Let's say, $250,000. Then if we do that math, 250,000 divided by 3 million, that would be a cap rate of 8.3 actually. So it's just a comparison method, right? It's a way to compare these different items. Net operating income is related to sale price by way of the cap rate. And an appraiser is going to use their knowledge of what cap rates of similarly sold properties are. What's the average cap rate? And they'll factor that in. And it looks more neatly written like this. There's another T formula for you. NOI over cap rate times the sale price or the value. Note that anytime something is on the bottom of a T formula, as one goes up, the other has to go down. That's just the mathematical way, right? So as the cap rate goes up, that's over here, the market value goes down. The higher the cap rate with NOI staying the same, the lower the market value. So you do need to know this formula and this relationship. What else? And then we'll call it. That's it for that. There's another example. Oh, and then if we keep going a little further and then factor out the debt service, now that we've hit the net operating income, we subtract debt service. Now we get to this thing that you've all heard of called cash flow. Cash flow incorporates subtracting the debt service. It does matter if you have a mortgage to determine the cash flow. And then the cash flow has its own, I call it a horizontal formula. Cash flow divided by the original investment you put into the property gives you your equity rate of return. So they're kind of, you can see some similarities there. We're going to get more into this when we come back next week. Here's a table from the book, and bring me your questions, and we'll get more into this. Bring me any more midterm questions. Look on Class Marker, I'd say, on the weekend, and make sure that he's not added that finance test. At the very least, it'll be up by next week. Let me know what you need from me. We have a couple more weeks to go, guys. So this is crunch time. We're gonna finish up. We're gonna get property management done and fair housing done, and some more comment section, trust account, timeshares, a couple things like that to finish out, and then we'll do some review. So be thinking about what you want to spend the most of your time on with the review. By the way, let me see real quick. We've got would you be able to and or willing to, interested in me having a Saturday review of some sort? Thumbs up if you're interested in a Saturday session. Not required, totally your option. There's a couple. Okay. Would this Saturday work, or would next Saturday be better? You could put that in the chat. This one or next week, next Saturday. And I'm thinking probably like 10 to 12. From 10 to noon, 10 a.m. to noon, something like that. This one's good for one. Next one's good for others. I would also live stream it, so whoever couldn't make it would be able to see that as well. Okay, I'll send out an email. I'm thinking we'll probably do it next week, because then we can make it more of a review after we've covered all of our content. So is that time on Saturday good for next Saturday, which would be what is that? The 8th. Saturday the 8th, maybe like 10 a.m. to 12-ish. So be thinking about that sort of thing. Okay. Well, I'll see you next Tuesday. Let me know if I can do anything to help. And happy studying.